In one of the most exclusive restaurants in Hollywood, Sandra Bullock walked in, blending in with the crowd, yet standing out in her own way. She wasn't wearing flashy designer clothes or dripping in diamonds, nor did she have a glamorous entourage surrounding her. Instead, she dressed simply but elegantly, exuding a quiet confidence that was unmistakable. The atmosphere inside the restaurant was filled with wealthy guests, sipping expensive wine and laughing among themselves. Chandeliers above glistened, casting soft light over the polished tables. It was a place where appearances were everything, where people came to show off their wealth, their status, and their power. As Sandra made her way through the room, a tall and well-groomed waiter immediately took notice. His eyes scanned her appearance, and a subtle smirk appeared on his face. Something about her, perhaps the lack of arrogance in her demeanor, didn't sit right with him. This was a place for the elite, people who flaunted their wealth and made a statement just by being there. But Sandra wasn't trying to make a statement. She was there for something much simpler, a quiet dinner. The waiter's gaze flicked toward a nearby couple, two wealthy individuals who seemed to own half the city. They exchanged amused glances, and the waiter, feeling emboldened, approached Sandra. With exaggerated politeness, he asked if she was sure this was the kind of place she wanted to dine in. This, however, was not a subtle observation. It was a clear judgment based on her appearance and her demeanor. Sandra, confused but composed, merely gave a small smile and a polite nod, but little did the waiter know he had just made a grave mistake. What happened next would change everything, and not in the way he expected. As the waiter made his bold and insulting remark, the atmosphere in the restaurant shifted. Sandra Bullock, who had been quietly enjoying her time, felt the sting of judgment in the air. The waiter, whose smirk was growing as he thought he was in control of the situation, leaned closer to her, clearly enjoying the discomfort he was causing. He tried to be helpful, suggesting that perhaps she should reconsider dining at such an expensive establishment, offering her more affordable options from the menu. The wealthy couple sitting nearby laughed, their amused eyes following the interaction like spectators at a show. Sandra, however, didn't rise to the bait. She simply smiled, a gentle, polite smile, one that suggested she had been through similar moments before. In this moment, Sandra wasn't just representing herself. She was carrying the weight of countless others who had faced similar, unfair judgments based on appearances. She knew the type of place she was in, and she understood the game people played when it came to status and wealth. What the waiter failed to recognize was that Sandra wasn't there to prove herself to anyone. She wasn't concerned about making a statement about who she was or what she had. She was simply there to enjoy her meal and her time in peace. The waiter, however, was blinded by his assumptions. His mind, shaped by the superficial standards of Hollywood's elite, saw Sandra as a nobody, someone who didn't belong in such an expensive restaurant. This was where his mistake became glaring. As he continued to speak condescendingly, the laughter of the rich couple continued, the whole scene becoming a cruel game in which Sandra was the unwitting target. But Sandra remained unbothered, her composure unshaken. She didn't engage with his insults, didn't raise her voice to defend herself. Instead, she quietly endured it, fully aware of the unspoken lesson in front of her. In this world, people often choose to judge you based on nothing but their own biases. What the waiter didn't realize was that Sandra wasn't bothered by his judgment. She wasn't shaken by the laughter or the mockery. The truth was that this wasn't the first time she had been judged for who she was, and it wouldn't be the last. But she had learned over the years that sometimes silence is the best response to ignorance. Speaking up or fighting back often only fuels the fire, giving power to those who think they have the right to belittle others. So she chose to remain quiet, to let the situation unfold without interference, knowing that her true worth couldn't be defined by a moment like this. Little did the waiter know, the universe had a way of balancing things out, and what he was about to experience would be something he'd never forget. And yet, as Sandra sat there silently absorbing the moment, something in the restaurant changed. The waiter's actions hadn't gone unnoticed. Keanu Reeves, a man known for his humility and kindness, had been sitting quietly in the corner, observing the entire exchange. He had seen what had happened, and without a word, his expression turned serious. He placed his untouched glass of wine down, and the silence in the room deepened. Keanu Reeves, one of the most beloved actors in Hollywood, was about to make his move. What happened next would shift the balance of power in that restaurant and teach the waiter a lesson in humility that he would never forget. The tension in the restaurant reached a boiling point as Keanu Reeves made his move. The atmosphere, which had once been filled with light chatter and the clinking of fine china, was now suffused with an undeniable sense of anticipation. The waiter, still basking in his apparent victory over Sandra Bullock, didn't even notice the subtle shift in the room. He was too caught up in his self-assured arrogance to realize the storm that was brewing just a few tables away. Keanu Reeves, seated calmly in the corner, had been silently watching the entire exchange. As soon as he saw the waiter's cruel treatment of Sandra, something in him clicked. It wasn't just the disrespect toward her. It was the ignorance and casual cruelty that he couldn't let slide. Keanu was a man known for his quiet strength, for the respect he commanded without ever raising his voice. And now, he was ready to speak up. With a calmness that sent a ripple through the entire restaurant, Keanu placed his wine glass down. The sound of the glass meeting the table was subtle, but it was enough to silence the room. Every eye in the restaurant turned toward him. The once boisterous chatter died down, replaced by a heavy stillness. The waiter, his confidence still intact, turned his attention toward the man who had just made his presence known. Keanu didn't yell, didn't resort to aggression. Instead, he spoke with a quiet authority that made everyone pause. His voice, steady and unshakable, cut through the tension. "That's enough," he said, his words simple but powerful. There was no mistaking the weight of them. The entire room went silent, the shock evident in everyone's eyes. The waiter, who had been feeling so certain of his position just moments ago, now found himself face to face with a man who commanded respect with nothing more than his presence. Keanu wasn't just defending Sandra, he was standing up for every person who had ever been unjustly judged, overlooked, or mistreated because of how they looked or who they were. His words, calm and controlled, weren't just a rebuke of the waiter's behavior. They were a reminder that people like Sandra didn't need to prove their worth. They already had it. As Keanu stood up from his chair, the tension in the room grew even thicker. People shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unsure of what would happen next. Keanu's reputation preceded him. Everyone knew who he was, but this wasn't about fame or status. This was about something much more important. It was about respect, about standing up for what was right, no matter the setting. The wealthy couple who had been laughing at Sandra just moments ago now found themselves shifting uneasily in their seats, as if they too understood the magnitude of the moment. Keanu wasn't about to let this pass. He wasn't just going to expose the waiter's mistake. He was going to teach him a lesson that would stick. As the waiter froze, caught between fear and disbelief, Keanu's next words were clear. "Do you know who you're talking to?" he asked, tilting his head slightly, his voice still calm but now laced with an undeniable disappointment. The waiter, caught off guard, stammered, unsure how to respond. Keanu didn't wait for an answer. He continued, pointing out that the waiter's actions had shown a deep disregard for both Sandra and himself, and that, Keanu knew, needed to be corrected. The room was still silent, each person aware that they were witnessing something profound. Keanu Reeves wasn't just defending a fellow human being, he was standing up for the dignity of every person who had been underestimated, who had been judged by their appearance or their status. The waiter's confidence had completely shattered. And in that moment, Keanu made it clear that the true measure of a person wasn't in their wealth or their fame, but in their character. And that was the lesson the waiter was about to learn the hard way. As the tension in the restaurant grew thicker, Keanu Reeves continued to hold the room's attention. His presence alone had turned the entire situation upside down. The waiter, still reeling from Keanu's calm but powerful reprimand, didn't know what to expect next. He had thought he could get away with his rude behavior, but now it was clear he was in over his head. The wealthy couple that had been laughing at Sandra only moments ago shifted in their seats uncomfortably, now understanding the gravity of the situation. No one in the room dared to make a sound as Keanu's gaze never wavered. Keanu wasn't just addressing the waiter anymore, he was addressing an entire mindset. The mindset that someone's worth could be determined by the clothes they wore, the people they were with, or their outward appearance. Sandra Bullock had been unfairly judged, not because of her actions, but because of assumptions others had made about her. And Keanu wasn't going to let those assumptions stand without challenge. His actions weren't about showing off his wealth or his status. Instead, they were a clear demonstration that respect should be given to everyone, no matter who they were or where they came from. At that moment, Keanu's focus shifted slightly. He turned to the waiter with a quiet question, asking him what the most expensive dish on the menu was. The waiter, still visibly shaken, stammered as he replied, "The platinum steak, sir." Without missing a beat, Keanu responded in his usual calm tone, "How much is it?" When the waiter hesitated and answered that it was $5,000, Keanu simply nodded and said, "I'll take two." The rich couple, eager to see what would happen next, exchanged glances, sensing that something much bigger was unfolding before them. Sandra, however, remained completely composed, knowing that Keanu's actions were about to make a statement that would resonate far beyond the restaurant walls. Keanu wasn't just ordering an expensive meal for himself, he was sending a message, one that the waiter couldn't ignore. As the waiter hurried to place the order, Keanu remained cool and collected. When the waiter returned with the food, he was surprised to see Keanu had already pulled out a chair not for himself, but for the waiter. "Sit," Keanu said calmly. This simple but powerful gesture was meant to break down the invisible wall of hierarchy that existed between them. The waiter, stunned by the request, asked in disbelief, "I can't sit at the customer's table." But Keanu, with his usual self-assurance, responded, "Why not?" The waiter shifted uneasily, realizing the weight of his own words earlier when he had said that Sandra didn't belong in the restaurant. Now, in front of him was a man who didn't need to prove anything, but was still demanding that the waiter recognize his own arrogance. Keanu's lesson was about more than just ordering an expensive meal. It was about teaching the waiter humility and showing him the consequences of underestimating others. The entire room watched in silence, captivated by the unfolding drama. They saw the waiter, once confident and dismissive, now reduced to a man who had to reckon with his own prejudice. Keanu Reeves didn't need to shout to make his point. His actions spoke louder than any words could. By calmly and deliberately showing the waiter the consequences of his behavior, Keanu made it clear that no one, no matter how rich or important they thought they were, should ever belittle another person based on their appearance or background. Sandra, quietly observing the scene, knew exactly what Keanu was doing, and for the first time that night, she felt that her silence had been validated. The lesson was being taught, and it wasn't just for the waiter, it was for everyone in the room. As the restaurant remained silent, the gravity of the moment began to sink in for everyone present. Sandra Bullock, who had quietly endured the waiter's condescension and the laughter of the wealthy guests, now watched Keanu Reeves closely, knowing that something profound was unfolding before her eyes. She wasn't just witnessing a man stand up for her, she was seeing something much bigger, a lesson in character, dignity, and the power of humility. Keanu had already made his point with the waiter, but there was still one final moment, one final question that would change everything. Sandra, ever so composed, had remained silent throughout the entire ordeal. It wasn't because she was afraid to speak up, it was because, for her, silence often spoke louder than any words could. She had been in situations like this before, where people had judged her unfairly, assumed her worth based on her appearance or the lack of obvious wealth. And though it had stung each time, she had learned that silence was sometimes the best weapon. It protected her from unnecessary confrontation, and it allowed her to retain control over her own sense of self. She didn't need to prove her worth to anyone. But as she sat there, she realized that Keanu was not just standing up for her. He was standing up for every person who had ever been dismissed or underestimated based on their outward appearance. He was showing that true value doesn't lie in the clothes you wear or the car you drive. It lies in how you treat others, regardless of their status. And it was this powerful message that Sandra knew Keanu was about to deliver in the most unforgettable way. As the waiter, now visibly sweating and struggling with the weight of his own words, stood frozen, Keanu slowly turned his attention back to Sandra. The silence in the room was deafening, but it was in this silence that Keanu's next move would land like a thunderclap. He leaned in slightly, his eyes locking with Sandra's, and without saying a word, his actions conveyed everything that needed to be understood. It wasn't just about the waiter's mistake anymore, it was about showing everyone in that room the true nature of respect. Keanu wasn't concerned with impressing anyone, he was concerned with teaching a lesson that would leave a lasting impact. The waiter, now fully aware of his mistake, nervously glanced between Sandra and Keanu. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, and in that moment, Sandra finally spoke. Her voice was calm, not filled with anger or bitterness, but with a quiet strength that demanded attention. "You didn't think I belonged here," she said softly, looking directly at the waiter. The words were simple, but they carried an undeniable weight. The waiter, still struggling to process what had just happened, lowered his head in shame. Sandra's question wasn't just about the moment. It was about the deeper issue of judgment and assumptions, the unfair treatment that so many people face on a daily basis. Would the waiter have treated her differently if he had known who she was? If he had known that she was Sandra Bullock, one of the most famous actresses in the world, would he have acted differently? The question hung in the air, and for the first time, the waiter realized the true depth of his actions. It wasn't about who Sandra was, it was about how she had been treated based on assumptions and biases. The entire restaurant now, fully aware of the situation, was watching as the waiter processed his mistake. This was the lesson that Keanu and Sandra were teaching, not through anger or confrontation, but through quiet, deliberate actions. It was a lesson about humility, respect, and the recognition that no one should ever be made to feel less than simply because of their appearance. Sandra's simple yet powerful question resonated with everyone in the room. It made them reflect on their own actions, their own judgments, and how often they had judged others based on superficial criteria. The rich guest who had once laughed at Sandra now looked at her with a sense of respect, realizing that she was more than just a random woman in a simple outfit. And the waiter, now faced with the consequences of his own arrogance, had no choice but to confront the mistake he had made. As the tension in the restaurant continued to hang in the air, Keanu Reeves and Sandra Bullock stood as living examples of humility and strength. The lesson wasn't just about confronting the waiter, it was about something much deeper: the way people often judge others based on superficial appearances. Sandra, despite being the victim of ridicule, had shown restraint and grace, and now she was walking away victorious without having to lift a finger in defense. Her silent response spoke volumes, proving that her worth wasn't determined by the laughter or judgment of others. Keanu's quiet intervention had sent a powerful message. It wasn't about wealth or fame. It was about how people should treat others, regardless of their status. Sandra's final words to the waiter echoed this sentiment. She asked him if he would have treated her differently if he had known who she was, forcing him to confront his own biases. The truth had become clear: respect isn't earned by status, it's earned by how we treat others, especially when we think they are invisible. As Sandra and Keanu left the restaurant, they reminded everyone that real value lies in character, not appearances.